Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
The 17th century, not an easy time for farming. The 21st century, though, a great time for decision spaces. This week, we're feeding the cows, harvesting vegetables, and trying to get a nice little schnapps distillery going on our farm. That's right, we're covering Uwe Rosenberg's farming sim breakthrough, Agricola. In today's episode, we'll talk game history and background before rising early to unpack this robust decision space in a classic deep dive, talking about things like pacing, scoring, player count, and more. Whew.
Well
Quite
done,
the intro. Thank you.
That must be the practice of the arduous farming that helps you get through that long-winded sentence that we teed up for you there.
You know, I do have a lot of experience waking up early to tend to the Zoom meetings, you know?
Have you grown your family of computers so you can get more Zoom meetings attended at once?
Yeah, I am. I'm taking the family expansion and just plopping new monitors onto my desk.
Yeah, nice. I have to be honest, Jake, I'm a little bit intimidated going into this week's episode. Agricola just has this like sort of titanic reputation in a lot of ways in the board game world, where, or at least maybe that's what I feel it has, where sort of people always have referred back to this game. And it's one that I've never really played. I sort of would go into game stores and people would be like, have you played Agricola? And I was sort of like, no, and I don't know that I need to, even though I know that it's amazing. And now that I'm really excited to say that I have, but I'm not sure I'm going to return to it a lot. I'm kind of like diving straight to the meat of it before we even did our review, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's pause on that for just a second because we should tell our pre-planners that are here that in the next week's episode, we'll be covering Dice Hospital. And then following that, the next game on the horizon that we're getting warmed up now in the Decision Space Discord is Blood Rage. So we'd love it if you want to play those games along with us so you can get a little bit more out of those episodes when they do come up. Okay, Brendan, with that out of the way, let's hop right into our ratings and review of this game.
Okay, I guess I'll go first since I kind of started down that path. So here I'll just say, at times, Jake, Agricola feels like interacting to me with like a finely crafted instrument. There's a specific way that it's meant to be interacted with. And if you're willing to play by those rules, then there's a ton of fun to be had and you can accomplish some amazing things. There's some agonizing decisions here that are really rewarding. But likewise, with real investment, there's room for real mastery. And watching someone produce a strong score can be a bit like watching a performer go off on an energetic and moving solo with an instrument. But I think that at times, Jake, Agricola can sometimes feel like having a prescription for fun, where if you do exactly what Uwe Rosenberg tells you to do, you're going to have a blast. And if you can manage to do it, you're going to have an even better time. But it's not without its rough edges, and it's incredibly rigid in the way that it wants you to approach playing its game. But I do think it's a canonical decision space that everyone should experience at least once, at least maybe twice, maybe 3 times, maybe 30 times. I don't know. But for me, I think this game is a 7.5 out of 10. It's an awesome game that I'm really excited to talk about and really glad to experience, but not one that I could see myself wanting to go back to because I think that it represents this sort of really different type of Euro game that I'm not as interested in playing as I thought I might be. How about
Yeah,
you?
really well done review, Brendan. I think that was, one of your best. I love the analogy to playing an instrument. I think a lot of what you said is spot on with how I feel. I'm giving this game a 7 out of 10. So
Interesting.
to me, that's like a good game. I couldn't see myself giving this a lower rating than that because I do think it's good. But I think there are also some things that I find to be flaws with the game. A lot of people use kind of terminology around like point salad as like a disparaging term sometimes, where it's kind of like, oh, everything you're doing kind of gets you points. And that's not really something I have a problem with typically. In fact, it's something I genuinely really enjoy in games. But I did find myself kind of at the end of games of Agricola just doing a ton of time searching through like, okay, I like literally going through like each action, like, okay, what of these things like gets me points, because the way the point system works is kind of, convoluted in that like everything gets you points in some way, but sometimes you need to like have three of something to get to the next point barrier, or sometimes just like one, so on and so forth. So I'm like consulting this reference sheet, and I think if that's something that you've really internalized, it's not an issue at all. But to me, that is kind of like a key experience that I think kind of pops up over and over with this game. Like once you have it internalized, I think a lot of what I found in my plays to be flaws or frustrating things totally melt away. But
Hmm.
as you're learning the game, I think you are going to be coming up against these rough edges, which puts this in a weird spot for me where I think, if you and your group, when you're making a purchasing decision, if you're looking for the next game that you and your group can dig into and play weekly or bi-weekly, for 20, 30, 40, 50 times, Agricola might be right at the top of my list as a game that you should check out for that situation. But if you're somebody who is what I think is probably more typical of people who are playing games in the modern board game space this day, where, realistically, when you pick up a new game, you're hoping to play it, one or two times a year. I think that Agricola might let you down. And I
Yeah.
think that it's just not designed in a way that so many modern games are today that really offers a lot of fun right out of the gate.
I think what's really interesting too is oftentimes when we record these episodes, Jake, we do our best to play a game enough that we could feel like an expert, or at least close to an expert. Like at least we have insights that an expert might have. We can sort of see the thinking behind decisions that our people are making. And I've played this game over 20 times now, and I'll say that I feel like a novice, and I know I'm a novice. The scores that I'm going for and what I can see other people's producing, I know that I'm still a novice at this game, despite putting in, I think, real effort and work to sink my teeth into. So, listener, as you listen to this episode, know that we know that about the game of Agricola, and I think it's okay that I speak for Jake here that we know we're coming into the game sort of from that perspective, which is different from the way we typically approach it, and that's just because of the type of game Agricola is. This is a game that when people love Agricola, you just play it 100, 200, 300 times, and it's a game that I think that kind of becomes a part of your monthly or weekly game playing diet in a
Yeah.
way. Like the people who love Agricola, they're going to be chewing on this sandwich for years.
And just for transparency here, I think for me, I played the game 7 times now.
Okay.
So less than you. So, maybe you'll see some distinctions just in that 13 more experience with it that Brendan has over me and how we're finding the game as we move into the discussion. I do think too, like there might be a little bit of a meta discussion here that's happening, which is like because Agricola has such a prominent place in like the history of our hobby, uh we feel even more pressure to
Sure.
say like to play it more times, where if it was like, a game that came out in the past couple of years, we would play it, somewhere in the realm of 10 times and say we played this game a ton, we can see that there's more there, we're just
Yep.
scratching the surface, but we wouldn't feel like, oh, do we play it enough? So I do think, we are certainly covering, like, we've certainly played Agricola as much or more and spent as much or more time learning this as other games that we've covered on this show. It just feels like there's a big gap in almost like us doing our due diligence because of the place that this game has in our hobby.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think now would be a really natural time to talk about some of that game background and history. And, on our show, Jake, we do varying amounts of sort of setting the context for a game. And I think if we can in this episode, I'd like to do slightly more because there is some interesting history with Agricola that we could sort of get into. And also, Uwe Rosenberg, also the designer of games like A Feast for Odin, Patchwork, Bonanza, Le Havre, all games we're going to talk a little bit more about in a second. I think that his design, some designers you sort of see, they'll do, I'm going to make a game like this. And they sort of iterate on that idea for a while. And then they try to find a whole new paradigm to like go explore. And I think with Uwe, so many of his games are sort of advancing on this core game idea and system that started with Agricola that it's fun to sort of look into that and understand it. Even from like, without Agricola, you don't get A Feast for Odin. Like A Feast for Odin is a response to the design and the success of Agricola and an evolution of it. So it's fun to sort of see what he was thinking. I found a nice interview that we can kind of dive into. But I'll share this first fact, which I wondered what I didn't know what Agricola meant. I did not take Latin in high school or college. So for fellow listeners who did not, Agricola just means farmer in Latin. It's kind of an interesting title.
I took 3 years of Latin in high school, and I
Did you
would
know
have
it?
not known that. Absolutely
Dang
not.
it.
At
You
one
know,
time, possibly. It makes sense though, agra, right? It's like
yeah,
a
yeah.
root word. Yeah.
What
Okay.
about cola?
That means one who,
Drinks.
one who farms.
One
No,
who
I'm making
farms.
that up. I have no idea.
I think that one example of how this game would not be positioned, wouldn't be the game it is today if it was designed today, is like no one would ever call this game Agricola today. If I have to
Why
tell you what
not?
the I don't I just do you really I don't know. I don't think that someone would call this game Agricola if it was
It's
published
just
today.
such a weird take.
It's
But
so
okay.
no, it's just like
We got
it's
we had
it's a
Carpe Diem come out a couple years ago.
okay, but everyone knows what Carpe Diem is.
Okay, whatever. Let's move on. We got a lot to talk about.
Okay, sounds good.
Here's an important fact about it. It dethroned Puerto Rico to become the number one game on Board Game Geek.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the prominent place that this game has in our hobby, I think that is not just that people have been playing this game and loving this game since 2007, which is in and of itself an incredible accomplishment. The way we see games just like once loved, like totally just fall off the face of the earth. Um, like a game that reaches that level of number one, it's like that is what a crazy hallmark achievement. I mean, there's like
Yeah.
how many games have even been number one since 2007?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that
I
question,
bet
but
it's like I bet it's like five or less.
interesting. I wonder. Yeah.
It's like
Probably
Gloomhaven, Twilight Imperium. I mean,
Pandemic.
Twilight Struggle,
Yep. Pandemic
Pandemic
Legacy.
Legacy. That might be it.
I wonder. Yeah. So I think that that does a good job sort of explaining why we sort of feel that shadow. I wanted to mention the people who published the most recent version of this game that plays up to 5 players is Lookout Games, which is also Uwe Rosenberg's company that he founded in 2000. That's just something I didn't know. You might also know them for publishing games like Patchwork. I thought it was notable to sort of share that. And then another thing that I wanted to know is that just in talking about how prolific of a designer Uwe Rosenberg is, just in his notable games alone, there's 35 games on Board Game Geek that range from like 1997 with Bonanza all the way to games in like Hallertau in 2020, which was a very large hit. A Feast for Odin, like I mentioned, Newsfjord, Nova Luna, Fields of Arl, Patchwork, all these games. And then also, Jake, the more I read about Agricola, the more I saw little like cropping up of this idea that Agricola is part of a trilogy of games called the Harvest Trilogy, which I don't feel like people talk about very much anymore. Like you don't hear about people say, "Oh, in Uwe Rosenberg's Harvest Trilogy." So it was interesting that at that time, people were talking about Agricola, Le Havre, which came out a year later in 2008, a game that people do still love, and then at the Gates of Loyang, a 2009 game, as this sort of special farming harvest trilogy, because that's gone. People do not talk about the
Well, yeah,
Harvest
because it's
Trilogy.
not a trilogy anymore. It's like 6 or 7 of them running
Yeah,
around.
exactly. Yeah. So that's it's interesting.
Now you're just like, oh yeah, Uwe with another farming joint.
Right. Yeah.
Or
It's kind of
Uwe.
like
Gosh, I'm gonna say Uwe like 20 times, but it's definitely Uwe.
that's okay. It's like his own Pharmamatic universe. We'll
Right.
call it that. So I found this really interesting interview. We're not going to read the whole thing, but I think I'm going to sort of like read little excerpts from it, and then we'll post the link in the show notes. So this is an interview from Dice Tower Dish that they did with Uwe Rosenberg, sort of talking about his design career, and he's talking about how early on he tried to design games like everyone else because he wanted to quote be an ordinary game designer. So he designed Bonanza, and then he spent a lot of time trying to make games that he thought the market would like based on games that already existed.
This is like interview answer is such a flex though. He's like, yeah, I designed Bonanza and that like gave me a bunch of money.
Yeah.
He says that gave me income, but I made a mistake that I was doing something everything else was doing. It's like so many people would be so excited to have income generated by the games that they designed. Like what a dream for people. Not
Totally.
Uwe.
Right. And enough to sort of have the flexibility to try to design however you want, which is kind of where he gets. And he sort of says at Essen in 2005, he played Kalis. And Kalis is a worker placement game that really changed a lot of designers' approach to modern board games. A lot of people consider it sort of the first really influential worker placement game. There's discussion of what is the first real worker placement game. That's maybe a less interesting question. But he says that after he played Kalis at S in 2015, 2005, all he did every evening for 2 weeks was to play Kalis. And then, in those
If
2
that
weeks,
wasn't bad enough.
he designed Agricola. So Kalis directly inspires Agricola.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
I did not know that fact.
So then after spending those 2 weeks playing Kalis every single night and designing Agricola, he sort of spent all of November and intensely designed and worked on the first 4 rounds of Agricola and got those first 4 rounds. This is a 14-round game, as perfect as he could get them. So he just day after day, 4 rounds, just iterated on and practiced designing those first 4 rounds of Agricola. And he did that 12 hours a day for like an entire week. Just played the first 4 rounds of the game over and over again. This is so fascinating.
It's really fascinating to me too. I think him like designing Agricola in those 2 weeks or whatever, I guess the framework of Agricola, it's just pretty funny to me. It reminds me of like, I don't know, have you seen like the anime One Punch Man where they're like, how do you get so strong? He's like, well, I ran every day and did 100 push-ups.
So for Uwe Rosenberg, I played
played
Agricolas.
Kalis every day for 2 weeks, and I designed Agricola. I was like, cool.
So awesome.
That's what it takes to make one of the most legendary game designs of all time.
I guess so. And then after he had perfected those first 4 rounds, he added some meat to the game. In their interview, he talks about he spent a lot of December then trying to sort of, in his words, perfect the final 3 rounds of the game. What should a, quote, nice farm look like, and fixing and tightening the scoring incentives, which I think you really see in this game, that there's a really specific idea of what Uwe thought a nice farm, what that was. Like that shadow is cast very strongly on this game. And then after that, he says, then I just created tons and tons and tons of cards for this game, cards upon cards upon cards, and played it for 2 years, play tested it for 2 years, and thought about nothing else because all he wanted to do was to play Agricola. Yeah. So it's a really good interview. I think if you're wanting to get more into Uwe's head, both about Agricola and just his design process in general, which I think is different than some of the designers we've talked about before, like maybe Reiner Knizia, who will work on lots of games at once. It's a really good interview and you should check it out. But know that sort of this came out of this cool process. And also, I think most importantly, Agricola for Uwe at this point in time represents a departure from trying to design games like everyone else, right? And what's so interesting is we were talking about how after Agricola, so many people just wanted to design games like Uwe Rosenberg. You have games like Keyflower that feel to me pretty inspired in a lot of ways by what Agricola did 5 years earlier, or even to today, like a game that we both like, Lost Ruins of Arnak. In a weird way, I don't think you get Lost Ruins of Arnak in its shape without something like Agricola. Very, very, very different game, but it lives in the shadow, just in the presence that Agricola had on the hobby in so many ways.
Or something like, I think viticulture is an example, one that's like very heavily inspired. But yeah, and Brendan, you're really making me second guess myself now. It is Uwe, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, because you said Uwe like 12 times, so
my bad.
It's okay. I forgive you. Hopefully the listeners will forgive us.
People are going to get their pronunciation pitchworks out again.
It's because we're reading it and it's phonetically not that way, and we're English speakers. So
sorry,
y'all. Uwe. Okay, Brendan, that was great. That was really interesting. I feel like Uwe is just flexing a ton in that interview. Like, yeah, I designed games in 2 weeks. It's not enough for me to make a living designing games. I'm going to do it different than anyone's ever done it before. And hey, thanks for doing it, man. Let's go into your previously recorded rules overview. If people have maybe just heard the word Agricola, but don't know exactly kind of how this game plays or what it's all about, this might give you a little bit of a better idea of how it goes.
Agricola is a 17th century farming simulation worker placement game for 1 to 4 players. It's played over 14 rounds, with important harvests taking place at set intervals at the end of some of these rounds. During harvest, players have to feed their families with food they've accumulated, otherwise we're incurring a severe negative penalty towards game end scoring, and they'll also harvest vegetables from any fields they've planted, and see their animal herds grow if they have at least 1 breeding pair of sheep, pigs, or cows. Each player has has a personal farm plot that's a 3x5 grid. At the start of the game, this humble farm has just 2 rooms and 2 people, the player's workers and family. Over the course of the game, players use these family members to collect wood, build fences, plow or sow fields, expand their home, improve their wood home to a clay or stone home, make improvements to their farm like gaining a fireplace or cooking hearth or maybe a well, get occupations such as a woodcutter or oven firing boy that augments a player's actions. They'll expand their family, gaining more workers while also increasing how much food they'll need to feed their family each harvest, and many more actions. Each round, players use all of their available family members to take one action in a shared display of actions, with more options being revealed as the game goes on. And when they select that action, they lock any other player from using one of their own family members to take that action in this round. For example, one space might allow a player to collect 3 wood, or to plow a field, or spend 5 wood and 2 reed to expand one's home. If those spaces aren't used, some spaces in Agricola have an accumulation rule. So the 3 wood space, for example, the forest, gains 3 wood each round. If no one uses the wood space, at the start of the next round, 3 additional wood is added and now there's 6 total wood available on that space. So the next player to use it gets 6 wood instead of 3 for using the forest space. After 14 rounds of progress, players score their farms, looking at how much of their original plot that they filled, how many family members they have, the type of home they have, how many crops and animals they have, and more. The scoring rules force players to be generalists who accomplish many things, but special scoring cards provide room in the decision space to explore lines of play off the beaten path. After scoring, the player with the most points is crowned the victor.
Thank you, Brendan. Let's jump right into our decision space exploration of this game, starting as we always do by trying to characterize the decision space. Brendan, why don't you go first? You've got more experience than me, so.
Silence. Both of us just don't want to tackle it.
But it's not
Okay.
that hard.
No, you're right. You're right. It's not that hard. So one of the key characteristics of Agricola that I think fits really nicely into our decision space framework is because of the nature of these worker placement spaces being revealed as the game goes on. At the start of the game, there's significantly fewer actions that you can take in the game. And you also typically have fewer workers at the start of the game than you do at the end. You start with 2 family members. You will want to probably add some more, hopefully more than even just one more, maybe get up to a 4 or 5 person
But
family.
that would cost more food.
It would cost more food.
So not worth it.
Yeah, it's just bad. Who would do that?
Yeah.
But so it's a waxing. It has this feel of being a waxing decision space. I think you have more options. The branch factor is higher towards the end of the game, and also you can do more. The later rounds are taking longer because everyone at the table has more workers with which they can get things accomplished, which is exciting because it gives the game this, I think, feeling of momentum. So long as people sort of know what they want to do and are hammering on those worker placement spots pretty quickly. But like you said, Jake, what's interesting is that even though like your available options are really growing and the amount of actions you can take are really growing, the scoring, I think, necessarily really focuses you in, because this is a game designed in such a way that you have to generalize for a huge chunk of your points. You have to expand your house. You should probably upgrade it. You want to fill up as much of your board as possible. You need to build some fences and have some pastures. You need to have some of each type of animal. You want some vegetables. You want some grain. Those are like, you need to accomplish these things. And then on top of it, you can score points in lots of different ways by getting just different cards to augment what you personally can do to score points. But overall, I think the decision space feels large, but not as large as something like A Feast for Odin because of how rigid the scoring is in the game.
Yeah. I think well put. I think the overall systems of the game lead to a waxing decision space, but like a lot of times on your turn, it has like just like an incredible tight feeling, right?
Yeah.
Like you might feel like on any given turn of the game, like there's just one space that you really want to go.
Yeah.
you know, and then somebody takes it and it, and oh man, like all my decisions are really shrinking very quickly down on me. So it has this interesting thing where even though like the larger systems are growing and growing and you're getting more workers, which extends your ability to do more stuff, like the amount you can improve your farm in the last round of the game is like exponentially greater than you can do with your first round action placement. It does have like from a round to round type of
Hmm.
feeling. I think like it has this like good tightness that I typically associate with a waning decision
Yeah.
space. So I think that's
Yeah.
just a really interesting and fun decision space to explore.
And I think for experts of this game, in a lot of ways, Jake, I feel like Agricola is a really, really complex. All board games can fit in this category, but I think Agricola emphasizes this point to some extent, in which it feels like a very stark, tight, and interesting math optimization puzzle. Like there's just spaces that end up strictly better than other spaces at different points in the game, and those can be different in different plays depending on what cards come out, depending on what spaces accumulate, depending on what your current setup looks like. But I think that even though there's tons of options by the end, the meaningful decision space might be a lot narrower than it feels to novices, I think,
Hmm.
just in sort of what I've witnessed. But the thing that I think keeps people coming back is those cards that offer just dramatically different ways to play the game, because you can so much augment what a real strategic path might be depending on early synergies that you get to sort of set up this powerful feedback loop of, oh, I can just put down plots really quickly. I'm filling my farm full of farm plots. In this game, it's going to be a little bit more farm oriented than it is going to be animal oriented, something like that.
Totally. Yeah, I think that a feast for Odin is going to be a really powerful point of comparison. That's going to
Yeah.
come up a lot as the other Uwe farming sim game that we've covered on this show. So I just would just encourage people, if they haven't, to go back and listen to that episode after you finish this one, because I think it will make differences seem like really stark. But it is interesting where, in that game, all the action spaces are just there at the start, uh, right? Which does have a different feel than when more powerful spaces are like coming out. And the mechanism there is like you can't really use as many of the spaces that take a lot of workers because you're just getting more workers automatically throughout the game. Um, so I do think that's like an interesting distinction that really makes the decision space feel very different to engage in. However, to your point about certain action spaces just being like objectively better than others, right? It has like a smaller objective decision space than all the options that are going to be available to you on any given turn. And that's exactly the same thing we were talking about in A Feast for Odin. It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, sure, you have a whole board of like, 84 action spaces or like whatever it is, but like you're really going to consider like five or less.
Yeah.
And I find it much easier to like ascertain the best action in A Feast for Odin. Like the confounding variables and like the lack of clarity in this decision space is like much greater. And I think a lot of that again is something that goes away as you play it a ton. But like, just like the simple thing of like, okay, well, what action like might come out next turn, or like a lot of time you would know for sure what action is coming out next time if you
Hmm.
had that like concrete knowledge of like these are the available actions in any given round. um that's something that could be really important to focus your decision space that I just like I could have like looked up and had access to, but I wasn't really like using that as I was like playing through the game. um yeah, and I think too just the scoring system just seemed like it was a lot it's make your farm good is sort of like an intuitive thing, but that is less intuitive than to me than the comparison in A Feast for Odin of like play Tetris and fill up your board.
Sure. Sure.
You know?
Yeah. I think that one thing that you're highlighting that's so important to me too, Jake, that I want to touch on is like the difference here is the difference in the feel of the decision spaces. Where like even in A Feast for Odin, when someone takes the spot that you want, and I think maybe we can talk about at the end of the episode if we like Agricola or A Feast for Odin more and why, and we'll spend a few minutes doing that, and then we can sort of like we'll table A Feast for a little bit. But is the biggest difference is the rigidity. It is the fact that there are certain spaces that are just strictly better than others. And that ties into the evaluation puzzle, because where this game becomes interesting is all about timing and when you do certain actions. And so much of is this action good is so dependent on, well, it would be really, really good if my opponent doesn't then take the action
Mm,
spot that I really need. So
yeah.
it's tough to solve that puzzle, right? Because the answer is I really want to add someone to my family and take the 6 wood, but I can't do both probably. So then which of those two is better? And if I don't get to do that, if I don't get to do the other, which becomes better? And I think that you're asked to sort of make these comparisons where maybe if you had a spreadsheet, you could solve, like, given my position, which would be better. But when I'm sitting there trying to do the evaluation of comparing these two resources to these and taking the opportunity cost of those away from you, and then you'll do this instead, like, all of a sudden, because the branch factor of this game is so high, like the number of different situations that you can find yourself in just grows hugely. It's so hard to sort of guess that I found myself, or to solve that, I found myself most of the time just going like, I'm going to try this,
Mhm.
which is fine, but I never feel like I have solid footing.
Totally. Okay, I have like two more thoughts here on just like characterizing the decision space before we get into a lot more things.
Hmm.
But so one of them is like, to your point, I think for whatever like the worker placement in this game feels very draft like, and
Mm,
I think that's true of like worker placement in general. Is you're sort of drafting out these spaces that are commonly available. But I
yeah.
think just because of the tightness of it in this game, like you really get that strong sense of like, oh man, like I hope this space kind of comes back to me and becomes available to me again. And I think that just speaks to what you're saying, just putting it in different kind of like terminology. Like I think if you like those kind of like tight drafting games, like that really comes through in the worker placement here. The other thing that I think is just important to note on for characterizing the decision space is like this game overwhelms you with like stuff to parse at the beginning. We haven't
Hmm.
mentioned the hand of cards you get, which is your like what are they called, like labor
Occupations.
occupations and minor upgrades.
Yeah.
So not only are, if you're new to this game, not only will you have different spaces out on the board pending player count,
Hmm.
so that's something you can kind of get over quickly. But yeah, you're going to be confronted with a different board setup for each player count. So that's one thing to parse in. You're also getting like a hand of, what is it, 9 cards,
7.
10 cards? Is it only
Oh,
7?
no, it's more because yeah, it's more. It's more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's more. So it's a bunch of cards, and they are not like I've like not super straightforward in a lot of
Yeah.
cases.
Yeah.
There's a lot to think through on like in terms of like different costs to play. Some can be end game scoring, some can like improve other actions. There's just a ton there. And I think uh, skilled Agricola players will say like this game is really a lot about efficiently using those cards to more, because once everybody's kind of like on the same page more or less about like what the beats are in this game that you're trying to hit, like
Hmm.
then it's going to be about like who's able to like use leverage their hand of cards to get that like small amount of value over their opponents there. uh and it's just a lot to take in as a new player, so I just feel like that is sort of something that I think modern games really shy away from, of
Yeah.
just because like you would like I think it would make sense if you want to play this game at like a really high competitive level that you're probably spending like 5 to 10 minutes just like staring at your stuff and sort of thinking, what am I trying to accomplish in this game, right at off the top.
And when I talk about the fact that, to me, Jake, Agricola feels like a prescription for fun from Uwe, the occupation cards and the minor improvements are the prescription. Like, you cannot ignore the occupations and the minor improvements, because if everything you're doing on the board is putting together, like taking the accumulating wood and all these other things, are you're building your engine. The improvements and the are and occupations are your gas. Like,
Hmm.
without these, you're not going to propel to the really high scoring games in the mid to high 40s and even into 50. You're not going to scratch it, because you need to sort of have these occupations build a solid combo that lets you, from your position, break the rules of the game. And that's what these cards are about. They're about, these specific spots mean something different to me than they do to you. And I said we'd stop talking about A Feast for Odin, but I think one difference is that that game has similar cards which play much less of a prominent role. And I think that part of that is not wanting to overwhelm the player. And Jake, you and I play a lot of games where cards have lots of text on them, and I also like learning Agricola felt overwhelmed playing this game when we weren't playing the draft variant, and when we switched to playing the draft variant, there's just so much to sort of
Yeah.
internalize and think about.
I felt the same way. I was just like, okay, I might be ready to do the draft variant like on game like 50.
Yeah,
You
you're
know?
right.
Like the decisions that come up in that draft. I mean, which is I think one of the things that like make this a game that you can play 50 times and continue to improve at, because like the decision making there I think gets so high level, right? To
Yeah,
make any choice in that draft, you essentially are like thinking through entire lines of play throughout the whole game, because Agricola allows you to know how the whole game is going to play out, because it plays out mostly the same
yeah,
every single time compared to a different game that would be designed in a way that like every round you get a random new action space, you know be, based on like a stack of like 30 that could come out. I feel like
sure.
that's how games would be designed today more often than not. But like you said in the interview, right? Agricola was designed to have like perfect balance,
Yeah,
right? So we don't have that. Instead, you have, the first round of the game is going to have these specific, seeded deck of actions places that's going to come out in a random order. So you can pretty much know generally the arc of every single game, which then you can internalize that, take that, and incorporate it into your draft making decision from those cards, which is just like awesome, but also like I am not going to get any value engaging in that, after playing this 7 times.
totally. And because what you're really drafting is the ability to fundamentally augment the system of games, the draft feels so much harder to figure out what will be strong versus what won't be than something like drafting a new set of Magic the Gathering, where there's these sort of core numbers that I can glom onto and sort of say, oh, this is a good card. It will be good no matter what. That's It's not really as easy to
No,
do in Agricola. It's really hard to find any one card that's just like a slam dunk. Like what you're looking for is like cards that have relationships, so combos that are good in a particular context where everyone else's cards also make this version of the game appropriate for that. Like playing in our Discord, I played in a specific game where we just flooded the economy with clay, and then all of a sudden that changes the entire game when both myself and my opponent have done something that make it so that clay is just falling from the skies, which is cool. That's why people love this game. But it also is so much harder as a newer player to understand how the systems will react to that.
yeah, all I can do in the draft is like, oh, okay, like like a lot of these cards have to do with clay, or like a lot of these cards have
Yeah.
to do with farming crops, so I'll just try and take up those and like hope that like some combos reveal themselves. But I did also find the cards very difficult to parse, and in my first 2, 3, 4 plays, like a lot of the occupation cards I chose to play and minor improvements I chose to play thinking they would be like good just gave me like zero benefit at all. Like, you know what I mean?
Which is so punishing when you've spent an entire turn
Yeah,
playing one of those cards and probably some resources to do it. It's really
totally.
devastating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like I mean, I think this kind of comes into it. This wasn't like a huge issue for me in my plays, like, but it is just one of those games that like in your first play, you're probably going to finish with like basically no points and
Yeah.
no progress on your farm. Like my first few plays were like just rough. Like, and I knew that was what I signed up for, so it didn't bother me. And it's like, and because it's not really like random in any way at all. Like it doesn't feel like I'm frustrated that I'm doing bad in at the way like at times I felt like when I was like learning like Tigris and Euphrates, another like
Mm,
very challenging game to new players. Like I didn't have any of that frustration. I was like, okay, cool. Like there's a lot to like learn here.
yeah.
But yeah, if you're somebody or like somebody in your group gets like put off easily by like failing essentially in a game, like do take this one straight off your list.
Yeah. I do think that that's part of the feel of the decision space too that people talk about so often, is that as a new player, like the top thing on your list is like you've probably succeeded at your first play if you didn't fail to feed your family. And that's what you're going to be worrying about, is just
Right.
feeding your two-person family throughout the whole length of the game. And
That's
it's
like what I
why
did, right? I just like
yeah,
kept getting the crop or like the food spaces. I was like, I don't know what to do. So I'm just like keep hitting that. And it's like, all right, well, at least I'm not starving. But like, while like those are just so inefficient, basically,
yeah.
compared to everything else people are doing that actually creates an engine to feed them.
Yeah,
and improve the farm.
you're probably not on the right track if you're sending off your family to go fishing every day when we're trying to be building a farm. But in my
Yeah,
early
right,
plays, that's what I
exactly.
was doing most of the time. Yeah. And that's why people love this game, because once you've mastered it, all of a sudden you're not worried about feeding your family. All you have an early fireplace that's allowing you to like turn to bake bread early on, and you've created this nice little food engine, and you're just trying to balloon. Um, and you experience that sense of mastery that you're never going to lose because it isn't a highly random game. Like, really, the only randomization that's happening is the initial cards that come out, and then there's a little variance of when certain spaces come out, but not a ton, like Jake was. So yeah, I feel like that was a good therapy session talking about our experience with Agricola.
Yeah. All right, so we get into some of like the more specific kind of like decision points in the game.
Yeah, I think we should. The
All right.
I Okay. Can we talk? Let's talk about the worker placement specifically a little bit more, because
Okay.
I feel like, Jake, the coolest thing about this game is for me is the accumulation spots, right? Where like the forest it's always going to get 3 wood, but if no one takes it, next round it has 6 wood, and sometimes in 2-player games, for whatever reason, that spot might get up to 9 wood or something, and someone's going to get this crush of wood. Also, I know what you're all thinking at home, the forest spot is never getting 9 wood. Yeah, you're probably right. Wood is so good in this game that it's pretty rare that you're going to get to 9 wood. But when it does happen, it feels amazing. And I like that this game, when I say it feels like an instrument, or at times it can feel like interacting with a finely tuned machine, like this accumulation mechanism makes the game feel, ironically, both organic and also artificial in a way, in a cool way.
Yeah. No, it I think the worker placement spots are cool. I mean, the accumulation spots didn't really like wow me, I guess, in the same way. But what I do like about it is like just like the wildly different like potency of different spaces, I guess. Like,
Mm,
yeah, like some spots you could go to and get like 9 wood or like 6 clay versus like I have to like go to this spot to get like one single pumpkin, and that's like all I am gonna do on my turn. But like you have to do that, right? It could
yeah.
still be like the best space for you, like a very important space to like start getting your pumpkin patches growing. I guess they're vegetables. They look like pumpkins.
I like that you're calling them pumpkins. I think we should make that a house label.
but you know what I mean, like that, and or like when comparing that to like the upgrade space or like the farm improvement space where you can like build a whole nother room and also build stables. It's like crazy, like, and also bake bread too or something, like I don't
Yeah.
know exactly, but it's like wow, like this space, like the spaces where you go to spend resources like give you everything. They give you
Hmm.
so much if you actually have the resources to spend them. But a lot of times, like to get resources in this game is so hard. Like
Yeah.
farming a crop in this game takes like so much effort that it's just like, is it ever worth it? Like,
Well, and then so you go to that spot where you get
right.
the grain
You have to
seeds.
okay, so you have to go to a spot to plow a field,
Okay,
one
first you plow a
field,
field
then you go to a spot to get one single grain, then you go to a third spot where you
to
can
reap it.
plant the grain,
Yep.
and then you won't be able to reap it until like a harvest, at the end of the turn or like on a future turn. And it's like, yeah, it's just, I mean, like, so you're gonna get like 3 grain out of it eventually over time, but it's just like, man, that's like so crazy inefficient, like doing all that stuff.
Well, and then at the same time, okay, so you imagine, you go down to the store, you buy this one holy seed that you're like
Yeah.
protecting as you walk home, but then you get home and it's like, ooh, I want to I need to bake bread, and I
Yeah,
need
you're
the
like, I'm just
seed to
gonna
bake
eat
bread.
this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess I'm gonna eat it now. But like, no, you cannot do it. You have to plant it. But it's so tempting so many times. Also, I feel like I have to shout out this moment because I know you and I both had it, which is like you go through this whole loop and then you're like, okay, I'm ready. I'm going to bake some bread. And then you go home to bake bread and you have no fireplace to bake bread
Yeah, you're
with
like,
because
crap.
you
Yeah,
never improved your
it,
farm.
it it's so tough, like, yeah, and that's the like those moments, like there are like these big tempo changing moments where it's like everybody's kind of doing the same stuff, right? Like you're doing the basic resource collection and like planting uh seeds and putting down your occupation cards like in the first few turns, but then like finding the right opportunity where you can like forego all of that to just like spend some resources,
Mm,
right? To get
yep.
the fireplace out, and you want to do it early, but doing it too early like you're not going to have any use for it because you're not
Yeah.
doing like the other like incredibly onerous process of like planting and harvesting. I do think like the trick of like identifying like when to take these like offbeat tempo moments where you're like, okay, I'm just like spending this for future gain is interesting.
Yeah. I like the decision around fences. That's one decision point that I found was really fun to interact with and figure out the right way to do it. Um, and that's because, from a scoring perspective, I only ever want to take the fencing action once. And with that, I want to build every single fence that I have in my supply, which will give me the maximum number of points for fences. But for actually growing my animals, I probably want to get some pastures down earlier that will allow me to have multiple animals and let them start breeding, get my sheep out there, get my wild boar. I don't get why they're called wild boar in the rules if I'm clearly farming them, but sure, okay. So I sneak them into the pastures, right? So there's this real good tension between like, I want to do the fencing action once I built up a ton of wood, probably already expanded my house, maybe built some stables, but I can't afford to wait. So solving that problem is impossible. And it's fun to solve impossible problems in board games. And then sometimes you have like workers who are like, whenever you take the fence space, you get to build 3 fences for free or something. That's not the exact card. It's something like that. But that's fun because in that game, I want to take the fencing action more often. And with that, maybe I can block my opponents from taking it. And that's why people love this game, is sort of that inversion and getting that on its head. But that, I like the fencing puzzle. And it also feels good to like flood your board with things, like when you can lay down a
Yeah.
ton of fences, or if the sheep space does accumulate to 5 or 6 sheep, just like, oh yeah, sheep on the farm tonight. And I'm
Yeah.
gonna cook 6 of them because I have no room. So
Right. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Hope y'all are hungry.
Yep.
Uh, that made me think of another point that I think is like weirdly like an absent decision space. Like when I was learning the rules of the game, like I thought I would have like really interesting like considerations about where to put things on my farm. And
Mm.
at least like for me at my skill
Oh
level,
yeah.
it's never come up that like
Yeah.
I've had to care at all about like where I'm placing things. And that just seems like for Uwe Rosenberg, who's like this crazy now has this reputation for having designed like tons of spatial reasoning games. I just found that interesting. Like it was just a place that didn't meet my expectation. Is that a place that you found interesting decisions at in?
I think I think that the farming, you can mess yourself up in some cases. I think just based on where you go, but it's kind of hard to do. Like
Like
as a
how?
novice,
Like I can't
like
even imagine a case of blocking yourself in.
I think I've made some mistakes with how I've set up my fences a little bit early
Yeah.
on, where like I couldn't, if I had done them slightly differently, I'd be able to finish one extra pasture. But beyond that, I agree
That's
that
like pretty minor
it's
though.
pretty minor, and the board in general just feels pretty trivial. It's almost like you're tracking things with it, but it doesn't
Yeah.
feel like a living space in the way that when you're building out your town square in A Feast for Odin, you're really thinking about the spatial decisions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Just an interesting
It's
point.
it could almost just be like you get 15 cards in front of you in this
Yeah.
3 by 5 grid. Instead, you have 15 cards, but it's not. I like that the metaphor is there because it helps you think about it. But yeah, it's
It's
trivial.
it's it's like a scoring signpost
Tracker.
where you're like,
Yeah.
okay, I have to like fill in all this stuff more than it's like I have to design my farm strategically in a way that will fit in. Because unless you're
Yep.
like really really skilled, you're probably not filling everything in anyway.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, which is just interesting. Like, shoot, I lost my train of thought. Is it? But I was gonna say something really smart.
You will again.
All right, go.
We'll
Let's
come
move
back to it.
on. Yeah,
Okay. Well, then I want to talk about
I hate
another.
when this happens. It's
uh,
just like
It's the
in the
podcasting
top.
cursed.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll come back to you. I'm going to talk about the meeting place space for a second, because I think that's another. This is, in my mind, one of the core decision points of the entire game. So this is a space on the board that is there from the very beginning, and it allows you to take the first turn in terms of player order. And that the opportunity to claim this comes up 13 times. There's 14 rounds in Agricola, so it can be reclaimed 13 times. That doesn't always happen. But when you take this, you also have the opportunity to build a minor improvement card. Who doesn't want to become first player and add a corn scoop to your farm? I like
Yeah.
that card. I like that card.
It does
But
seem like this space gets taken like
a
with the
lot,
first move of the game, like very
pretty
often.
often. And that's because going first can be so strong, right? You're getting the first shot at a double accumulation space, a space that was probably a little below curve last turn and now is probably above curve in terms of what you're getting this next turn. But I think where this becomes even more interesting is figuring out when you don't want to take this, where sort of you and your opponent are pursuing different paths, and you can forgo spending a turn building a minor improvement card somewhat later in the game and get more out of your turn and sort of bide your time. But then the game flips it on its head by later on. Some of the tiles that get revealed are just super powerful. Like there's that space, Jake, that allows you to sow a field and to plow a field and sow it, and sow all your fields in one action. That space just feels like, oh my gosh, it's like 17th century farming Christmas. Like I love that action space.
So good, yeah.
So I think that this game has in it's rigid in its scoring. It's rigid in terms of what you have to accomplish. And it's also a little bit rigid in terms of when you want to be doing certain things. Now I lost my track too, a little bit.
Okay, well, I remember what I was gonna say,
Yes,
so I'm just gonna
yes.
say it
Okay,
now before I forget. It's
good.
almost like when you're built like so there are rules around how you can build out your farm. This is going back to like placing stuff on your farm, right? There are
Yep.
rules around it, but it's almost like those rules are put in there not for any kind of like strategic or decision space consideration, but like purely thematic reasons.
Yeah.
Like it thematically wouldn't make sense if you could go like house, farm, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense you had to put all your house together and you put your farming spaces together, but it doesn't actually like lead to any interesting decisions. So I just think that's not something we encounter a lot of like rules for purely thematic reasons, and I kind of think this is approaching that,
And
if
Uwe,
not just 100% that.
we talked about how in A Feast for Odin, the feast itself kind of takes on something similar, because in that game, so in Agricola, you have to feed your family like we've talked about, and it's actually a meaningful task. You can fail to do it and you're penalized pretty hard if you do, and it feels terrible. In A Feast for Odin, you're basically just given all the food you would need to feed your family at the start of these rounds. So that's a similar
Not
example in a
every
way.
round.
No, but
There are way more decisions around like how to accomplish your feast phase, in my opinion,
you can
than
do it
in like
better.
how to build out your farm.
Definitely.
Like
And
in
you
terms
can
of just like spatial reasoning, not like the
totally.
decisions that you make and when to build stuff.
Well, I right. Like you can definitely do it better, but he's got you covered in terms of the design.
Yeah.
Whereas here it's like there isn't really a doing it better.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Or maybe we just aren't good enough to
Or
sort
maybe
of
we
see.
suck. Yeah. So
Yeah.
like if like you're at a level where that matters a lot and you're really thinking about it, like
Talk to
let
us.
us know. Let us know.
Yeah. Okay. This is not the type of game where we should have this conversation, because the right answer is I want to do exactly what Uwe tells me to do, and to maximize my number of points by getting exactly this many animals and exactly this many of everything in the game. But what systems do you like engaging with the most, Jake? Like where do you have the most fun?
Uh, I mean, I think this game does have those moments like I don't know what the right terminology is for this, but like it has the moments where like you kind of get that like feeling where like things like align just right, where you
Hmm.
get the exact space you want, you have enough to pay for it, and you're have a like occupation card that you're synergizing with to make it even better, and that does feel fantastic when it happens. So I think I really do enjoy the occupation cards and like engaging with those as I have them and as I like learn more. I think that's pretty fun, and just like how that interacts with the overall system of drafting these worker placement spaces.
Yeah. I'm going to tell a story about one that I had recently in a game I played this morning that was really fun, that I think is a good example of this, which was that I got a card that lets me expand my wood house. For normally you have to pay 5 wood and 2 reed for every new room that you would add to your house. This card let me expand for 2 wood and 2 reed. And that was super fun because it made it such that I could very quickly build up to 5 rooms and then have wood change left over to plop some stables down. So I think that for me, yeah, I agree. Some of the best moments are when the occupation cards come together and you can sort of do something at a time in the game that you wouldn't normally do. And my second answer is I really like when my animals breed. And I thought that I like when I heard about Agricola, I thought that, if I had 6 horses, those would turn into 3 horses, and then I would have 9 horses.
This is
But
the Uwe
instead,
breeding rules,
yes, when you have 6 horses, or if you have 12 horses, you still only get one more horse.
which
And
is fun, oddly the exact same rule that he uses in all of his games.
I think from a mathematical perspective, I'm sure he has like the perfect reasoning why, but it's not as exciting. Let,
But it
let me
just
see the
cracks me up.
explosion.
It
Yeah.
just cracks me up from like it's such a design hallmark. Like that's
Yeah.
exactly how it works in A
A
Feast
feast
for
for Odin.
Odin. I think New York Zoo is the same, right?
I can't remember. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure it is, but I think it's the same everywhere, and it's just
Yeah.
like that is like such a design hallmark that, and it's just such a funny thing to be a design hallmark. It's like,
Yeah.
yes, I design games where no matter how many animals you have, as long as X is greater than or equal to 2, you get plus one more
Yep.
animal of that
Yeah.
type.
Yeah. At least he's
That's me.
consistent. Yeah.
Yeah,
And getting animals of a type that you shouldn't be able to get early feels really cool too.
yeah.
Like if you can get boar on your farm before sheep, and like before, not with like,
Ooh,
you get a car. Yeah, it's like, ooh, I have the pigs. But ultimately, all these things kind of end up feeling a little bit trivial because again, you have your prescription and you have to bring what Uwe thinks is the right farm to the table. You can't go hog wild.
right.
You have to get sheep, hogs, and some nice horses.
You definitely want to get at least one of each because the first one you get is a net gain of 2 points.
Yep.
But then you're gonna want to have like varying numbers of more going forward. And I think like that's where I'm just like that's probably the system I like engaging with the least is the scoring in this
Yeah.
game. And I think it's trying to accomplish like something intuitive that's just like, well, of course horses are better than sheep. So, every single one more that you get of those is or cows or whatever they are. You know what I mean? The
Yeah.
brown ones
Yep. The brown ones.
are
Yeah.
worth more. So like it's intuitive in that way, but it's just constantly like I'm like looking over my sheet, especially at the end of the game, and like doing this kind of math, almost like Power Grid like, where I'm another game, Euro game of similar era, where you're
Yeah.
like kind of at the end, you're really just like, okay, well now is the time when I have to like pour over this map and like do the math and make sure I'm not like just doing something that's going to be objectively fewer dollars. And here it's like objectively fewer points to me.
Yep.
Um, it's just kind of a pain in the butt.
Yeah. Yeah. I do like that you get when you're playing the game, it feels good knowing when you're learning the game that almost anything will get you some points. Like that does
Right.
like, oh, I
Except for that's not true.
what do
It's
you mean?
like reads don't get you points.
That's true. Okay. Anything you add to your farm board is probably going to get you a few more
And
points.
some things that you add to I'm just saying, like it's not like nothing is
One to one.
that straightforward, but it
Yeah.
is like generally improving your farm is good.
I
You
want to
know,
fill it in. I want the
getting
15 spaces
resources
to be full.
is like generally good, but not always
Yeah.
because like having leftover like wood, clay, and stone
Yeah,
don't
is
help
bad.
you,
Yeah.
but having leftover food stuff is helpful.
Oh yeah, because you're trying to build up those stores.
I guess so. Yeah.
One thing that I find really interesting about this game is how long the later turns can take if you're playing like a 4-player game, and many people have 3 or 4 or even 5
Right.
workers. Like the rounds can be pretty long towards the end of the game.
I think that's pretty typical of a lot of these games where it's something I like a lot of time where like the first few rounds are just like, oh wow, we're flying through this thing, right? And then
Yep.
it's like the last like couple of rounds of the game could take like as long as the whole previous game.
Sure.
What other games that Lost Ruins of Arnak has that exact same thing
Yeah.
where it's like the fifth round of the game might take as long as the first four rounds just because like people are like now mathing things out, spending all these like accrued resources, like comboing off. Same
It's sort
same
of
effect here.
this sort of underwater cities to some extent, maybe too, like this positive agency feedback loop type game, which this is, right? Like you're
Yeah,
trying to get a little loop and then you're trying to exploit the loop.
it
And
is. I'm hoping. It's
yeah,
not always for me.
yeah,
Tell you that right now.
yeah, for sure. That's what you're trying to accomplish.
That's
Yeah,
yeah, right.
same.
It's yeah,
I will say too, one thing that made me realize how tough this game can be is that I've had games of this where I feel like are really successful. I do achieve that sort of positive agency loop, and I score in the mid or even the high 30s. I feel amazing, and then I play again and I get like 6 points,
right.
and it's so
Well,
frustrating.
I think it's like also like I've had a similar experience. I wonder. I should check like what my best score, because I've had some pretty solid scores in this game.
Yep.
I've scored 38 in a win over some more experienced players. I scored 35, 32, 31. So I've done pretty good in some of my plays, but
Yeah.
also like in a more recent play that we have going now between us, it's async, it's not done. I got like a occupation card early that was like really seemed to reward having clay. So I
Hmm.
started being like, oh, I'm just gonna like go heavy in clay because I'll be able to like upgrade my. I think it like allowed me to like improve my house with clay like right off the bat or something.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like bypass like wood as a system in this game. And I'm like 3 or 4 like turns into the game, it's like you cannot do that and be successful in this game. Like now I know. I didn't know then. I thought it might work out, and I like this. So this game, like you're just gonna absolutely stomp me in it, and that's fine. Like it's like a fun like learning experience. But yeah, like as you're learning this game, even as you're learning more about it, I think like the you can find yourself doing things that are in hindsight just like not
Totally wrong.
allowable. Totally wrong. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, and that's the rigidity coming back into play,
Hmm.
where like you think you're going down the right path, and then it turns out it
Yeah, I'm
wasn't
like,
the
oh,
path
I've
at
like
all.
got an early occupation that seems pretty good. I'm gonna try and leverage that throughout the game. It's like, well, oops, like you not that one. Can't do
Yeah,
that with that one, you know?
you completely wasted 4 turns, which
Right.
is
Yeah,
you threw away the
exactly.
game. Yeah,
Yeah.
because those 4 turns mean losing all of this potential
Yeah.
efficiency. Yeah, maybe okay. Let's talk about player counts a little bit. How many player counts have you played this game at, Jake? I know you've played it at 2 and 3. Have you played it at 4 also?
Yep. I play at
Okay,
2, 3, and 4.
cool.
I think
What do
just one
you?
game at 4.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm in a similar boat. I've played it the most at 2. I've played it some at 3 and like 1 or 2 games at 4. What do you think of the player count differences? They feel like fundamentally different games in some ways.
Totally. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think I mentioned that at the beginning, but like you really have to like relearn the board because the
Yeah.
starting board is so different at like 2 and 3 and 4.
Yep.
I think it's 4 where it's like, oh, you can just get like the stone at the very beginning of
Yeah,
the
you get
game.
like it's like one stone, one reed, and one food becomes a space.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
in a two-player game, like you can't get stone until like almost the very end of the game. So
Yeah,
it's
it
like,
feels
yeah,
like.
that's like very different.
Hmm.
Just in that like one small consideration. So yeah, I do think it feels very different. I have played uh entirely asynchronous games. I would love to play it, in person. Maybe that would change my experience more. But I think like for async, the it feels very similarly. I think I probably like the 3 and 4 player games more than the 2 player game, just because I think like the 2 player game is asking you to do more blocking, like intentional
Yeah.
blocking.
Yep.
Like if somebody's like got a couple occupations out that are like really around like clay or fences or you know farming, then you can really hose them by just being the person that takes that space they're gonna value and force them to really work hard to get anything out of it. And I think that for me is less fun than the game of we're all trying to like there's still like some room to mess each other up, but it's more incidental, it feels like, in the 4 player game, or like maybe more targeted towards somebody who's like actually out in front, and we're all just focusing on like getting to that positive agency loop.
Totally. I also want to note that the what is scarce in different player counts feels pretty different. I don't have enough of an understanding of the game to always know what's going to be scarcer depending on the player count. But just in playing, I've sort of noticed like, oh, at a higher player count, like at 4, it feels really hard to get as much read as I
Hmm.
need to expand my house. I'm struggling to get that as much. So that I think makes the read cards better at a higher player count. And I think that that's something that later designs try to move away from a little bit. I think some of Uwe's later games try to sort of have a more consistent feel and consistent access to the same sort of strategies, regardless of the player count. Not to say that either way is better, but that's something that I noticed about the experience. I really like it at 2 because I like how sort of tight the decision space feels and how rewarding it is to sort of consider what your opponent might want and respond to that and trying to react and get in front of them. But at the same time, it really does accentuate player skill differences. If someone gets to their third worker significantly before another player, that like 1.5 that point 0.5 additional efficiency can really spiral and be very meaningful, and like you said, Jake, become an opponent blocker potentially.
Yeah, I think also. Well, one of the interesting kind of decision points of this game is like when you should take the first player marker space.
Yep.
So, that this has the mechanism where, there's just a space to become the first player. And also you get to put down a minor improvement when you
Yeah.
do that, which is great. And I think that is a lot like the decisions around when to do that are a lot more fun and interesting in a higher player count game. Just way more nuanced, right? Like if it's a
Mm,
4-player game, and I'm second because the person in front of me is the one who just recently claimed that mark or whatever. Like, I probably am fine with not taking that space, but maybe, there are certain cases where I just need to do it anyway because there's one action like I so desperately need at the start of the next round, and potentially I'm like afraid that somebody after me is going to take it and then I won't be second, I'll be fourth or whatever.
yeah,
You know what I mean?
totally.
That's a lot more interesting. Where I feel like in a two-player game, like it can almost feel like a little bit over centralizing in my noob games, where it's like you're gonna have a very different game if like you're just going back and forth, taking that a bunch from each other. But it almost feels like you kind of need to do that because having the person you're playing against just like sit at the first player space, like it going first seems really strong in this game.
Yep.
I think even more so in a two-player game where like the wood, uh, what is it called?
The forest.
The forest, like where it's filling up every turn multiple times, like being able to have access to that, especially if it gets skipped and all of a sudden you're getting 6 wood from that spot is huge.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't want to be spending like it also feels like bad and not that fun to be spending like tons of my agency just being like, well, now I'll be the first player again next turn. I don't know.
Totally. No, I think you're completely on. I agree. I'm tracking. Can we close, Jake, with a quick discussion of A Feast for Odin?
Let's do it.
We both like A Feast for Odin more.
Yeah,
Correct?
yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I was thinking about that too, and I actually just looked up the weight between the
Mm,
2 games because I think A Feast for Odin, at least in my mind before I sat down and really, like, dove into Agricola, like, was impressed upon me as, like, this, like, much bigger game and, like,
yeah.
with that, like, the heavier game, uh, and it is heavier according to Board Game Geek. It's, like, 3.8 compared to Agricola's 3.6.
Mm,
But they're pretty close, right? Like there's
yeah.
not a huge difference there. And I think just speaking for myself, like A Feast for Odin was much easier and intuitive for me to pick up than Agricola was. I think
Yeah.
your mileage will vary there. I think other people, clearly other people think that Agricola is the lighter of the two. But I think, just early the investment to like get into these games I think is comparable, and I just feel like for me I just the amount of fun I have going through a game of A Feast for Odin, like I just feel like I'm ramping up so much more. Like it just seems like everything I'm doing in Agricola, it's like is I'm just able to do it more.
I think that one thing that I was surprised by is in playing A Feast for Odin, my ability to the emergent stories that would get told with my board and my houses and my sheds were fun and interesting and funny, and I missed that aspect in Agricola a little bit. Which is a strange criticism from someone who's a co-host on a show called Decision Space. But that's one criticism I had. And I also thought playing A Feast for Odin, Jake, I remember talking in episode 59 where we covered that game, that one of the things that I really lamented was that the cards weren't more important, that you could ignore the occupations in that game. And I sort of was like, no, I want these to be meaningful. I don't want them to be meaningful, it turns out. I like
Anymore.
that it's a
Yeah.
system that I can ignore, actually. And I've realized that one of the things I like about A Feast for Odin is the openness of that system and the flexibility of that system. And that when a good spot gets taken, there are other good spots that you can go to, and it's not only a game about timing and tempo. It's a component of it, but there's more going on. And I
Yeah.
think that overall, I just had more fun making those decisions. But if you like a rigid, rewarding game that is gonna, if you play it 100 times, you're gonna be able to master. I think Agricola probably gets the scales tipped in its favor, given how uh, like sort of tightly designed it is and how balanced it is. Yeah.
I think I was surprised in just to find out like just how similar these two games
Yeah.
are. And like for me, like I clearly favor one to the other. Um So, like, for that reason, because they're so similar, it's almost like the death knell for Agricola. Like, I
Sure.
don't know why I would play that over a Feast for Odin
Yeah.
when they are very similar. But I do think there are, I know for a fact there are a lot of people out there that prefer Agricola to a Feast for Odin. I think that's valid. To me, the biggest distinction between the two is like in one, you're working from like resource rich mindset, and the other, it's a resource scarce mindset,
Yeah.
doing as much as you can with very little in Agricola. And I think that can be more rewarding when you have these games where it's like, wow, I did a lot, uh and and it was tough, and look at my farm. Like, you really get a sense of accomplishment. I think the sense of accomplishment there is greater than in a Feast for Odin, where it's like everybody's doing a lot, like you're guaranteed to do a lot. It's just one person's going to do the most.
Yep.
So I think that like is a lower sort of like peak moment of like achievement and winning the game. But I think the like a higher level around the table of people having fun.
Totally. Yeah, A Feast for Odin is a rock show, and Agricola is a string quartet. Both
Yeah.
awesome musical experiences, but I'm gonna roll up to the rock show and
Right.
have a blast. Yeah.
Cool.
But I'm really glad I played it. It's a really interesting game, and the history is so fascinating. Maybe Jake, one day on the show, will return to Uwe Rosenberg's farming uh, genre. Essentially, maybe
Yeah.
we'll check out Fields of Arl or something like that. Another game that people seem to really love. But next week
Is
we're going to
that
be
is that
covering.
in the prequel trilogy or is that in the sequel
I think
trilogy? I
that
can't
that's
remember.
the reboot.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I would love to. I think just like my final thought on this game, like I think it's one I will play again. I
Sure.
think if somebody was in the Decision Space Discord and are looking for games section or whatever, and like, hey, I got a table of Agricola open, I would join it, on the caveat that like I don't want to do the draft
Yeah, I
for
knew you were going to say that. I'm kind of in the same
it.
boat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give me the cards I could use. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, next week, as a reminder to all you pre-planners out there, we're going to be covering Stan Kordonsky's Dice Hospital, a fun little dice drafting, dice placement game where you try to heal dice. It's hilarious, kind of.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll
Yeah,
be
it'll
a
be good.
fun discussion, and kind of a break in some ways
Yeah.
from more, kind of getting back to a lighter game. But that doesn't mean, of course, it's not a great game with interesting decisions. But you'll have to listen in to find out what we think.
Awesome. And until then, if you have thoughts on Agricola, on this episode, on anything we've ever discussed on Decision Space, or even things you think we should discuss on Decision Space, we'd love for you to stop by the Decision Space Discord and tell us about them. You can find a link to that in our show notes. Alternatively, you could message us on Twitter at DecisionSPA. Or you could write an email to us, and you can find our email or a form to email us on our website, decisionspacepodcast.com. Until next week, have fun playing games.
Yeah,
That's
we'd
not
like
even a
to.
tagline. We don't have a tagline.
No, yeah, no, that's great. I have a feeling there will be thoughts on this one, so excited to read them. And as always, let's on our way out thank Hembry for our intro and outro song. Reach out. Goodbye.
Bye.
Close enough.